Yeah, and little things do matter. I mean, again, in our sport's different in short range Benchrest, where we see some things, but the same physics applies. If that bullet doesn't start out right, coming out of the barrel, whether you're shooting short range or long range, it's not magically going to get back onto target. The other thing that does make a difference for both of us, and I'm sure you'll agree, is case trimming. Again,
Yes.
early on, a friend of mine, we were sharing a reamer, and the reamer had in 6 ppc, a 1510 trim length, 1.510. And as long as my friend and I were make sure that we were trimming our cases, and the case neck didn't grow enough to encroach near that trim length of that reamer, our rifle shot fine. But if we got lackadaisical and lazy where we weren't trimming our cases and the cases started growing to 1506, 1508, 150, whatever, but starts getting close to that neck, that trim length, all of a sudden our rifles would immediately quit shooting. So we said, you know what, let's get a new reamer. We'll buy a new reamer that's got a 1525 trim length, and we'll never have to worry about, having our rifle shoot bad because, we got lazy or we forgot to trim the case necks the night before the match. So great. So I can remember being at a range that I shoot locally here, and we had an honest day at the range, 9 o'clock, left or right crosswind at 200 yards. And my rifles were shooting. I normally will practice with 4-shot groups once I kind of have things working, and just to see the seating depth and the load. And my 4-shot groups were producing maybe big 4s or 5s at 200 yards. And I'm like, this rifle should be shooting much smaller. I'm going to do everything I can to this brass to give it the best possible chance to shoot. So I dusted off the case trimmer, and I started trimming my brass back for 6 ppc to 1490. I had a 1510 trim length, and I wanted that case to be all uniform and well back from that. Immediately, the rifle came alive. It started to shoot dots. It got to a point where I was telling my friends, look, I think I'm onto something with this case trimming that I didn't think was going to make a difference. And they would trim some cases and load. Other cases they would load without trimming. And I would give my best effort. And we had a great day where it's an honest left or right condition where you could really see what the rifle was doing with the tune. And every time that it was brass that was not trimmed, it would be like a glob. And every time the cases that were trimmed, you could see a demonstrable difference. And again, it was one more lesson I needed to learn, that keeping your cases trimmed does make a big difference for the for ignition and for that rifle's for that tune.
So I used to have a friend that we used to go to matches together. He was my shooting partner, right? Mm-hmm. But we were always competing against each other. And that's what keeps us going oftentimes, right? Right. You don't care if you don't care if you come in, if you two are the last ones on, as long as you beat him. That's
you
all
beat
that
your
matters.
buddy. Yep.
Yeah. So that was us, right? Well, this is back in 2010 or so, 2011. This is when I'm trying to get into the game, and I'm trying to do all the testing, right? That's what I decided to do. I'm just going to test everything for myself. Mm-hmm. Well, I wasn't trimming brass, and my whole thing was, if it needs to be trimmed, it's gone, right? That was my thing. Mm-hmm. Well, then I realized I was throwing away a lot of good brass, and then I decided I'm going to trim brass. Mm-hmm. But because I have a 1,000-yard range, I figured, well, why waste the opportunity to do a test? Mm-hmm. So I took 5 rounds untrimmed brass, and I trimmed 5 pieces of brass with a Giraud trimmer that I borrowed from a friend because I didn't want to spend the money. And he'd go out to 1,000 yards, and I shot my first 5. We had a walkie-talkie. I said, okay, clear. He'd walk out and pace the shots, and he'd get back and behind cover again, and then I shot the next 5. And he called me back. He goes, I don't know what you did on the last 5, but holy smokes, that is a tiny group. You know, that you cut that group like by 2/3. It was like the first group was like 8 inches, and the other one was like 3.5 or something like that. Wow. And So of course he's like, "What did you do? What did you?" I said, "I don't know. I guess the wind was died down on the last, but I knew what I did." So the last group, the small group, was trimmed. So
Yep.
from there on, I trim every time. Every time, the drill trimmer, the chamfers trims everything, so it gets used every time.
Right. Yeah. Again, little things stack up, and little things do matter, regardless at 100 yards or 1,000 yards. Certainly there's overkill where you're weighing the cases to a point and things. But some of the basics, where the primer seating depth was consistent below the case head, trimming the brass, bumping the shoulder. In our game, I like to feel some resistance in closing that bolt handle. I don't want it overly tight, but I do not want that bolt falling down to where there is a little bit of positive head space where that case is literally fire forming every time. Now, I know for you guys, I think you probably are wanting to bump that shoulder back, 2 to 4 thousandths, possibly.
We bumped to 2,000s.
Okay. All right.
That's
I'd like to bump to about 1,000ths, and again, and kind of gets into a different subject of getting the proper full length die to make sure it's, sizing properly based upon the reamer that you're using for your chamber. But
Yeah,
that's-
I obviously, like I said, we operate under totally different conditions, right? We're laying on the ground. There's dust flying at you all the
Right.
time. So if you try to do 1,000th and you do
Yeah.
500 pieces of brass, that just there's going to be variance. And if you try to keep it at 1,000th, there's going to be some brass can be really tight,
Right.
and some that's not, and that just becomes problematic, especially when you're trying to you can upset the gun, and then there's debris flying in there, and it's just
Right.
it becomes a part of it is obviously shoots very accurate at 2,000s, but if you do any less than that, then it becomes unreliable. And
Yeah, and I do want to point out, I think, Eric, you would agree, when you are setting up your full length die, take your time. Once you bump that shoulder back, if you've gone too far, the only thing now you can really do is try to fire form it to bring it back. When I am setting up my full length die, I like to use a selection of brass that might have been shot with a little bit lighter loads as well as hotter loads, because I really like to see where I'm setting up that bump back to where it's a consistent bump back. It's not set for bump back for maybe some of the brass that I've been using testing lighter loads versus hotter loads, because the hotter loads, certainly that brass has grown more.
Right.
And will require more shoulder bump back. So it's really important not to use one case. Okay, now I'm going to set up my full length die. I really want to see, maybe several cases at least, to where I'm getting a proper selection or sampling, if you will, of how much that shoulder needs to be bumped back.
Yeah. Also, older brass requires more bump because it springs back more, especially if you're not a needling. It just becomes a moving target on you.
And I